Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. We are a year-round talk series bringing you the best creative voices across film, television, and theater. And today we are incredibly fortunate to be joined by Chiara Aurelia to talk about her latest series, Tell Me Your Secrets, on Amazon Prime Video. And there's so much delicious complexity to this character as a whole. And so I actually wanted to ask you about when you first got the scripts and began working on it, some of the conversations that you had with Harriet Warner, who's the creator and writer of this show, to really understand the deeper layers and nuances of what she wanted you to bring to screen in your performance.
Yes. Harriet is incredible. And so when I got the first script, as you may know, if you've watched this series yet, there's, it kind of, you get an image of what you imagine that Rose is going to be and what she's going to become over the course of the show. But I think that deep diving into a conversation of her life and her backstory and the in-depth trauma and experiences that she's had throughout her childhood not only give you grounds to make choices in my performance with her, but also kind of give you a better idea of where the show's going to go. And I think that like the arc of her character storyline and the arc of where it goes was all magically planned out and played in Harriet's head from the beginning. So kind of being able to listen to her talk about that, and she was so passionate about the show and all of the characters she had created, was truly amazing and incredible. I felt like I and this world that I'd never seen before. It was such a pleasure.
And did you find as well that Harriet kind of gave you a roadmap, but also gave you a lot of space to really make your own choices and bring certain things into her as a character as well in the process of making this?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, she's super collaborative. I have a bunny here and he's drinking water loudly. No, she was extremely collaborative and extremely open. And I think that we had really in-depth conversations about all of the choices that were made for her over the course of the season, which was amazing. And also, there's an element of it as a showrunner and a creator of a series like this, to where she may have the railroad tracks and kind of have built the what's it called, the base, or the kind of have the first blueprints. But kind of as we have more conversations and as she gets to know me better, I think that we were able to kind of bring a part of myself into the character as well.
That's so fantastic. And you were touching upon that very first scene in the first episode, which is so explosive for your character. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the detailing of how certain elements and tones of that scene came together, because, obviously we learn a lot of reasons why Rose is behaving in a certain way later on in the show, but at that point we don't know. So how did you and Harriet really think about the way in which Rose is approaching that situation, the aggression that she's exhibiting, in a way that later on, when we know the motivation for it, we'll understand it, but it doesn't fully give it away at that point, because there's such a delicate balance to trying to achieve that?
So for that initial scene, I mean, I'm generally attracted to characters and stories that I think aren't initially what it seems. And I think that there's a beautiful story behind Rose. And I think that being able to discover that from the beginning and have kind of overall conversations about where it was going to go, and as well as why she was making the choices she was something that I thought was a beautiful experience and something wonderful to explore. I Starting with that first scene, I think that she's trying to protect herself and trying to protect her family, and that might not come out in the best way, and not in a good way at all. But I think that there's always reasons behind why people make the choices that they do as human beings and also as characters. So being able to kind of have a backstory as well as a motivation for her actions was extremely beneficial in all of the scenes throughout the show, as well as her journey as a whole.
Yeah. Did you think about her as a character as being someone who, to a certain degree, doesn't really have repercussions to some of her behavior and feels a little bit untouchable when she's outside of her home. Obviously when she's with her family, it's a very different story, but because of their position and their place in society, she almost has this sense of feeling like she can't be touched and nobody can mess with her.
Definitely. I definitely think there's an element of that. I think that sometimes when people come from homes that can be more challenging, I think that in my experience with her, she may want to have more control over the things that she is capable of controlling. And I think that outside of her home environment, she has more power and she feels strong and mighty. And even when she may be down or weak or not be feeling her best, I think that she tries to put a strong foot forward and tries to kind of take control of the situation in the best way she knows how, which I think also is what attracts her to Lily Rabe's character, Emma, as she is the first person who questions Rose's authority and also her character, which is, I think, an unusual experience for this girl growing up in such a small town like this.
Yeah. And the first way that she does that is by smashing her face into a mirror in a public
restaurant. Yes. They have taken an aggressive approach with that as well. But
which I also wanted to ask you about, just filming that moment, because, you obviously had a stunt team that were working with you and Lily on that moment, but also because of the intimacy and the size of the location that you were in and how close the cameras were, the two of you also would have had to step into that scene as well. So how did you both work on finding the balance and the intensity of what that moment was going to be?
I mean, it's always a challenge with scenes where you aren't necessarily doing all of the action, because you're trying to implant yourself into the situation the way that you know how. Lily is incredible in the way that I feel like she sets a precedent and like really good boundaries for her being able to feel free, and the actors around her feeling free to make strong choices and bold choices and really enter that space. So although I wasn't necessarily having my face actually smashed into a glass mirror, we definitely had moments of where we needed to scream and we needed to just get into it. And Lily and I kind of, as one and as a whole, created a space where it felt really comfortable to be free within that, which I think was part of why it came out well.
Yeah. And with that scene as a whole, did you think or decide that that was the first time that Rose had really lashed out in that particular way aggressively? Or did you feel like this was something that has happened before with other people?
It's an interesting question. I think that was the first time that someone had lashed out at her. I think she had definitely had moments, clearly, of aggression and aggravation previously. But I think that having someone approach her in that capacity was a new experience for her. And I think that was really really unique, and also really drew her to the situation more because it was so unusual to what she'd experienced thus far in her life. I think that Rose uses her voice and her strength as a weapon to protect herself, but I think there are many situations in which she enters where she ends up hurting other people.
Mm-hmm. It also feels like she's a character who very much just kind of lives in her own headspace a lot and goes off into quiet corners. And, she even talks about the fact that she knows that there's very few places where people go when they want to escape in a really small, tight-knit community like that. So for yourself, how did you construct the way that she would spend her days and spend her time outside of the moments where we get to see her on screen, and where she would go to kind of steal away from everything and try to form this escapism for herself?
Yeah, I think that Rose in this town felt sometimes like she was drowning, and she felt claustrophobic. And I think that's a feeling that we can all relate to, where you feel like you can't free yourself from a situation that you're in. And I don't think she knew how to escape this feeling that was overwhelming her on a daily basis. I think she found places and people that made her feel comfortable to be who she was, and also made her feel comfortable to speak her own voice and make weird choices and do weird things and not be this perfect child and daughter all the time, where she could just be a human for herself. Chiara spent quite a bit of time in exploring the parishes of Louisiana while I was down there, because we were filming in New Orleans, and getting the opportunity to kind of see what those environments are actually like was really interesting, and to see how smothering it can be to be in a town where everyone knows everyone, and anything you do or say or feel is watched as a spectacle by everybody in your surroundings at all times. So I think that was really interesting to learn about. And I think that she, did everything she possibly could to try and escape this world that she was living in.
Yeah. And her family dynamic is such a fascinating thing to start peeling away the different layers of, and even starting with the fact that her parents literally lock her in her bedroom every single evening so that she can't go out and she can't escape and do anything. And then you've got the fact that her dad clearly like gaslights and manipulates her. How did you think about the way in which that just would really take such a toll on her psyche and the emotional experience of what that would do to her, with that being her day-to-day existence?
I think that it's extremely traumatizing, and I think that it left her no freedom to explore herself or make choices for herself. And I think that's part of why she evolved into the person that she was due to her surroundings and the choices that the people around her were making. And it's so I don't know what the word is. It's heartbreaking to see, to live through that and imagine that. And I think that she was so traumatized from such a young age. And I think that although her parents may have been coming out of a place of love, I think that it left her feeling constantly controlled and frustrated, and all of the feelings that someone who suffers from childhood trauma and abuse feel. And I think that is just horrible to think about and to live through.
Yeah. And the relationship with her dad has an interesting dynamic to it, because it feels like he's the only person that can really crack through her veneer. There's that moment where she's laying in her bed. She's just so angry and frustrated at everything in the world. And he knows exactly how to, pull her out of her shell. And, then they go out for that meal. And by the end, she's laughing. And it's the only time throughout the entire show where I think we ever see her laugh at all. And so I wanted to ask about the way in which the two of you really constructed that very different side, because as much as there is that strictness, at the same time within the dynamic, there are moments of lightness and where she does come out of her shell in a different way with her dad in particular.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in any situation where there are, there's always the bad and the good. And I think that sometimes the good is an excuse for the bad. And I think that that's a life thing, as well as something that's a really big element of this show, that people and situations may do something good in hopes of, two wrongs doesn't make a right. And I think that that's a really interesting thing that Harriet plays on a lot in this show, is we all have a part of ourselves that is good and bad. And although there might be some joy and light and love in Rose's relationship with her father, I think that may be, in abusive relationships and situations like that, there's always an apology and there's always some way to make it better after things go wrong. And although I think Rose is telling herself that that's what makes it right and makes it okay, it doesn't necessarily. As a little behind the scenes moment, we actually filmed that scene in that restaurant on my birthday in New Orleans. And my mom used to make me a pecan pie every year for my birthday in my life. And they surprised me on set. We were eating pecan pie throughout that whole scene all day. And Harriet wrote that in, a little example of Rose and Chiara combining over the course of that show. But yeah, that was definitely an interesting little tidbit.
And then with what we eventually learn about her dad, it also becomes clear that Rose has heard details of this before. This isn't new news to her when it suddenly comes out at the end of the series. And so I was curious about whether you felt like she actually had a real awareness that she believed all of these things, or if for her own kind of self-preservation that this was something that she just had to mentally block out and just be like, there's absolutely no way that this could be true, that this could have happened.
Definitely. I think she did her best to block it out. I think there were definitely moments when it seeped through the cracks and she felt it. And I think those were the moments in which she made some choices that she may come to regret later. And I think that it's an interesting feeling when you really love someone and you really love your parents, but at the same time, you know that they aren't doing the right things. So I think at the same time, she's trying to protect her family and protect their image and make sure they're safe. But I definitely think she has some awareness that something isn't right and she doesn't know what to do about it.
Yeah. And, as she starts gravitating more and more towards Emma, there's that really wonderful scene where Rose comes into the hair salon at the beginning and she's just kind of like not saying a single word at the beginning and just kind of like quietly sizing her up. And then she kind of like playfully has that sense of humor of like, give me a haircut that matches my nose. And there's so many different tones that you and Lily managed to hit within that scene. And so I just wanted to ask you about the journey of how that came together. And, if it was something where you had the opportunity to rehearse it a little bit and try different things and different beats and different tones within it at all?
Yeah, there were definitely moments where we had the opportunity. I felt like the directors over the course of this show and the creators would kind of set boundaries and set like the playground, and then would kind of allow us to roam free and play within that, which was wonderful. I know on the day we had some time to really explore the choices that felt right for those scenes. But in terms of preparation beforehand, Lily and I developed a friendship and a relationship kind of off of set as well as on set. And I think that there was a lot of conversation about what felt right and where this journey was going to go and what would be a correct way to lead into it. And I think that kind of, working on that backstory and working on that future plan allowed us to feel more comfortable and have a better understanding of what would naturally happen in that moment as well.
Yeah. And she becomes so enamored with Emma throughout the entire season. And it's kind of fun to watch the journey of how that plays out. But she's enamored with her for numerous different reasons. She kind of sees Emma as someone as well who doesn't really connect with others and is kind of like watching the life that she's built for herself, and also in believing that Emma has done certain things as well that are similar to some of the things that Rose has done. It's like, okay, like this is how you process it, this is how you deal with it. So she's also trying to learn from her. So how did you construct all of those different layers of the different reasons and the different ways in which she's just observing this woman and trying to take everything in?
Yes. Well, I mean, in different ways in life, I think that there's a lot of different aspects and complications to any relationship. But I think that as Rose kind of gets more enthralled and more interested in Emma and her relationship with her, I think that her perception and her perspective of the situation might change. And I think that based off of Emma's actions, I truly believe that Rose it falls in love with her. And I think that as someone who is in love with this person, based off of the choices that she's making and the ways that she's hurting me without her being aware of it, I begin to lash out and behave differently towards her and towards myself over the course of this show and over the course of our relationship this season. I think that it's an interesting feeling to become so obsessed with someone. And I think that Emma is the only aspect of freedom or comfort that she has in her world. And I think she is grasping onto that for dear life in every way she knows how. And I don't think that's healthy, but I think that's all she knows how to do. And I think she's trying to get out through this human, basically.
It also seems like Emma's the first person that has looked at her and acknowledged her in certain ways, like that early scene where, you know, Emma tells Rose's mom, like, your daughter is really beautiful. And then there's that moment later where she hugs her, and it just feels like Rose hasn't been hugged by anyone in her life in so long. And so how did you think about the emotional responses of what that would do to Rose to be seen in that way and to have someone look at her and say these sorts of things, or even just to physically touch her?
I think it brought her so much joy. And I mean, it shows even these small, minuscule moments have created a whole world in her head and created a whole atmosphere where she feels so much comfort. And that also shows how much I believe she's been through before as well, that these tiny bits of love and compassion just from another human can have such a big impact on her. And I think that I think that it's interesting how moving and touching it is to just have someone see you, even in the slightest aspect. I think that, you know, just a tinge of noticing her and seeing her as more than the Lord family daughter, I think it has a huge impact on their relationship as well as Rose's feelings towards Emma.
You also did so much with that scene where Rose breaks into Emma's house and is just going around and looking at all the different objects, because the way that you used that scene, it wasn't just about her learning about Emma's life. It was her imagining what it would be to have that life. And again, kind of the enamorment aspect when she puts on her clothing. So as you were kind of like looking at the different objects that you were going to go around that room and pick up, how did you think about the different types of connections that you wanted her to be finding in that moment?
Yeah, I think she had a very vivid imagination in those moments, and I think which with each item that she touched in each space that she entered, there was a new picture and a new journey and a new story that she could have with this woman. And I think that when the note was left under the door, it all came crashing down. All of the feelings that she had had, kind of, her walls started to cave in. And she suddenly realized that this potentially wasn't an option. I think that she's balancing imagining her life with Emma and also potentially just wanting to be Emma and wanting to have that freedom and that energy and that not caring what anybody thinks feeling that she gets when she's around Emma. And I think that there was a lot of space to explore within that in all of the different moments.
Yeah. And that moment when Rose feels like she's been betrayed by Emma, when she finds out some of the details of Emma's past and the fact that she's not who she thought she was, I thought you conveyed that idea of just the way in which Rose is fueled by her emotions and responds, you know, through anger, purely led by emotions so well. You know, it's that whole thing, like when you're that age, especially as like a teenage girl, where it just feels like your skin's on fire. So with the way that Rose is such an emotionally reactive character, how did that make you think about a lot of her choices and a lot of her motivating factors in the decisions that she makes throughout the series?
Yeah, I think that in that moment specifically, her whole world is crumbling around her and everything comes crushing down. And I think as a young woman, even now, and as I was at that age, I think that something so small can have such a big, can feel like the whole world. And I think that's all she's ever learned. All she knows is to make choices driven by her feelings. And I think that her feelings can consume her sometimes, which is what leads her to some extremely bad choices. And I think that over the course of the whole show, she's very driven by what she feels, and whether it's joy and excitement and investigation or anger and sadness and depression and feeling like the whole world is ending. I think that those feelings as a young woman and a young actress are so overwhelming and so big that it really propels her through the story and through this journey, growing out of being a kid and into a young woman.
And with the fact that you got the chance to have so many intimate scenes full of emotional intricacies with Lily, what are the things that you feel like you came away learning, about acting and craft just from sharing scenes with her and working alongside her in that way?
I have definitely said this before, but I think that I learned the most in my whole career, or one of the most the most growth that I received was from working with Lily on this show. I think that watching her not only as an actress, but as a woman in our industry, and the power and strength and unity that she brings as a lead of a show to our working environment and to the characters and to the show as a whole and as a human being is truly incredible. And I notice myself every day making choices based off of what I learned from her. I try to be as self-aware as I can, and I think that she taught me to speak up for myself as, again, a woman and an actress, and demand what I want and hold strength in my character and the choices that I've made, and to really believe in myself. And I think I learned a lot from the acting experience and from her as an actress, and as well as the person that I want to be in this industry and the woman that I hope to become over my career.
And beyond just Lily as a female lead and Harriet creating the show, you've also got an amazing group of female producers behind the series as well. And it really feels like they were so protective over the vision of who these characters were throughout. Do you feel like it was really kind of like stemmed from them, the way that there was this protectiveness over these characters that allowed you to take this character of Rose and really just lean into the darkness and lead into those complexities in a completely different way, wholeheartedly?
Yes, I wouldn't have had the capability to experience any of the things that I experienced with Rose without these women creating the path for me over the course of this season. While filming, I felt like they always left space and room for me and time to allow me to do the most with what I had. And I think that what initially drew me to this project was the amount of in-depth female characters, as well as the amount of incredible female creatives that were behind the camera. And I don't think anything in this show would have been possible without all of them.
Yeah. Well, there's so much complexity and nuance to your performance throughout the series, and it's really astounding what everyone has accomplished in this show. So congratulations on that, and thank you so much, Chiara.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.